through the library. It's challenging for me to do so. My name is John Stedford. I'm the director of the Hamilton Center. And this is our very first event we've ever hosted, so we're very excited to see you all here today. Let me sort of explain a little bit about the Hamilton Center. The Hamilton Center is designed to sort of enable discussions and explorations of the core texts and great debates of Western civilization, with a particular focus on the American constitutional order. And so I'm very excited that our very first event has two wonderful speakers to talk about the American founding and the American political order. So let me briefly introduce them, and then we will get started on our program today. So first, in the middle, we have Adam Smith. Adam Smith is a 260-year-old Scottish philosopher who wrote Wealth of Nations. No, I'm sorry, he's been hearing this his whole life, so sorry about that. In reality, Adam Smith is the Edward Osborne Professor of U.S. Politics and Political History at the University of Oxford, where he directs the Rothermere American Institute. Before coming to Oxford, he taught for 16 years at University College London. His specialty is the American Civil War, its causes and consequences, but more broadly, he's interested in democratic politics. He's written a number of books. His most recent is The Story Present, Conservatism and the Problems of Slavery in Northern Politics, 1846 to 1865. He's currently writing a book about the Battle of Gettysburg in History and Memory. Smith also regularly presents on the BBC Radio and has a podcast called The Last Best Hope, Understanding America from the Outside In. To my immediate left is Patrick Griffin, the Madden Hennebrey Family Professor and the director of the Keogh Naughton, did I pronounce that right? The Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Last year, he was the Harold Vivian Harmsworth Professor of American History at the University of Oxford. This prestigious fellowship, created in 1922, is awarded to a distinguished American historian who spends a year teaching, researching, and leading seminars at Queen's College, Oxford, and at the Rothermere American Institute. Griffin is the author of a number of books, including The Townsend Moment, The Making of Empire and Revolution in the 18th Century. His latest book, out this spring from Yale, is The Ties That Bind on the Age of Revolution. So with that, I will leave it to our speakers.
Well, thank you so much, John, for the kind introduction, and I want to thank Robert and Jill especially for the kind invitation to be here. I'm honored that we're the first. I don't know, we'll see if you'll be honored by the time that I finish, but thank you all for turning out for this. Many years ago, when I was a graduate student, I was TAing for a guy by the name of Bob Wiebe. It was my first such assignment. We were doing the American History Survey course, and the TAs were charged with coming up with a question for the final exam essay. And boy, I still remember that moment. Bob was a small D Democrat to a fault. He wanted us, the graduate students, to set the agenda. So we batted around some ideas, and mine ultimately won. I felt really professionally accomplished at the moment. Here was the man who wrote one of the seminal texts in American history, The Search for Order, seemingly agreeing with me. And why wouldn't he? After all, I was convinced I was saying something meaningful and profound. Here's what I proposed and what we went with. Quote, would John Winthrop have signed the Declaration of Independence? Now, I was fixated with this sort of question because we had spent so much time on the Puritans and read a great deal of Winthrop, and because we had focused a great deal of our attention in the course on the run-up to the Declaration of Independence and the ways that Americans after the Revolution did or did not live up to its principles. Or more to the point, they thought they did or did not live up to the principles. The question seemed to capture it all in a pithy way. Today, when I think of it, of course, I cringe. Oh, how naive. More to the point, what a stupid question. Asking undergrads to answer that, they had no real tools to do so, and it's a bear of a question if done right. I know that now. I didn't realize it then. I just thought it was clever. I'm shocked that Wiebe went for it, but in his democratic ways of doing things, he did. The lovely fool. God rest his soul. Today, the question sounds downright subversive. In recent years, that notion that we share a common point of reference, what I've called elsewhere a common national vanishing point, a position in our history that all refers back to, and that has shaped subsequent experience and has given the more recent past a sense of perspective, seems misguided. We are asked now to think of other reference points that point to the darker, more pernicious aspects of the American past. What has changed, perhaps, are a whole boatload of assumptions about our common past. Not that we now only fight over it, we always have, and usually more viciously than we do now, but the very reference points we use to launch our attacks and mount our defenses have become a question. When I was a graduate student, it was unspoken and did not have to be articulated that 1776 mattered because it was shorthand for who we were and who we are. I should add that we did not embrace the date uncritically. We were too good at being historians, even if we were naive, to just take 1776 and the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as some sort of holy writ. Oh, we pushed and we pulled at it, struggling to make sense of how and why it became the date that it did. Our task was to understand the past and even to understand our frameworks for understanding the past. That was our charge. We knew that the appeal through the ages of 1776 and our whole concept of the founding was bound up in mythic conceptions about the past, about how a generation of people at the time of the revolution and then subsequent generations used the date and the events around it as a shorthand for something that made us different. We knew, as sure as we did, that the past was a foreign place, that the use of dates was a construct, something used to make sense of messy social reality. That was assumed as the critical importance of the date 1776 to the American story. You see, when Wiebe and his merry band of graduate students I was part of agreed to ask my insipid question, to suggest that 1776 did not matter, or more precisely should not matter, did not dawn on us. Although Wiebe's understanding of the American past would not have jibed with mine, we all still started from a few essential starting points, even if we understood they were constructs and shorthands and not real. My job today is not to tell you that the founding still matters in the way it is played out in our politics today, just as it is not my job to say that the ideas behind them are bankrupt. This is not my task as a historian. My job, I've come to believe, is to do what that silly question I proposed at its best demanded. My job is to put things in context and to understand how they came to be. I can do no more. In fact, I think we're ill-equipped to do more. The chief virtue of a good historian, I think, is humility. Humility before the complexity of the past and the tangles of all the interpretations of the past through the ages, and humility before our limitations as fallible beings. Instead, I would like to do the work we are equipped to do. I would like to give you an idea how 1776 came to be. Now, this is based on my recent work, and it stems from my growing appreciation of the difficult task Americans were up to at the time of their revolution. As we shall see, the so-called founders and the common people who were their contemporaries were not alone. And as I will suggest, the idea of a founding itself and the selection of the shared vanishing point of 1776 was fixed on for a very good reason. It would be wise to appreciate the work this one date has done, as I will argue, rather than focus on the ideas it connotes. Well, what work did it do? As I've argued in a great deal of things I've already written, it did the difficult work of bringing a difficult revolution to an end. Don't underestimate the violence, uncertainty, vacillation, and chaos of the American Revolution. Not only did it represent a war of independence, it also became a time when the world was turned upside down. All sorts of furies were unleashed. The latest work on the American Revolution, and some of it really quite good, describes a place and time when and where Americans, as much as the French a few decades later, would deal with the furies unleashed. Poorer men were stepping out of accustomed roles. So were women, some of whom had played critical roles in mobilizing their communities for a war effort. Enslaved men and women had run away in unprecedented numbers. One scholar, with some justification, has called the American Revolution, quote, the greatest slave rebellion in American history. Native communities on the frontier were fracturing as the backcountry became a Hobbesian world of all against all. Patriots coerced communities in New England. Loyalists engaged in appalling violence in the Carolinas. New Jersey, divided between the two, fell apart at the seams. You get the picture. To end this was no simple thing, and words or fine sentiments alone could not, because words or fine sentiments alone do not explain why people struggled. In fact, the Declaration of Independence in 1776 was less the holy writ that it would become than a justification for rebellion and a rationalization of what was happening in America as British sovereignty dissolved and as a new one was being imagined. The American Revolution was a kaleidoscopic set of conflicts driven by all sorts of motivations, and in many cases simply survival. Reason did not end revolution. No, what brought an end to it was a state that could manage the many tensions that had haunted what had been British North America and that were unleashed by the revolutionary process. The genius of the Constitution and its federal system was that it recognized that a single unitary state would not allow for myriad revolutionary wounds to heal. The federal system, as good recent work shows, was not a behemoth, but it did possess enough power to bind the whole together and allow for the distinctive histories and revolutionary experiences of each of the constituent parts. In fact, the states, now united, were freed up to do much of the work of ending revolution. This was not by design, but it emerged in Philadelphia as a lowest common denominator of sorts, as a group of well-connected men tried to solve a common problem. Their genius was in reading not so much the possibilities of the age, but the limitations it imposed. Those limitations, first and foremost, pointed to the desperate need to bring back from the brink local societies that had been in the revolutionary crucible for quite some time. Order was needed, and building a state that could contain tensions ranked as the first order of business. Order, I hasten to add, did not mean justice. Whole peoples were written out of the state and sacrificed on the altar of order. African Americans, most pointedly. Natives as well, who would not be held at bay by laws and customs, as would be the case of the enslaved, but by lines drawn across the landscape to keep them from civilized society, as it was called. Women would earn the proverbial half loaf. They would not achieve formal political rights, and in truth there was not a big push for them as patriarchal assumptions still held sway, but they would enjoy cultural cachet. Poorer whites would in the short term enjoy political privileges even if they clung to the margins socioeconomically. Here was the lowest common denominator of bringing revolution to an end, a denominator rooted in America's colonial past and the limits it prescribed, and how the revolution itself and the mobilization and politicization it underscored created the conditions for popular sovereignty. Some groups could be invited to enjoy the privileges of the new state, protected. Others could not. That was a tragedy. What I think helps us appreciate that this is what Americans were up to during their founding is in recognizing that Americans were not alone. Others were also at almost the very same time negotiating their own distinctive problems and necessities in the vital and urgent case of state formation. The United States, of course, was born during a broader age of revolution, when peoples in both the old world and the new either had to create new states whole cloth or revisit the very bases of state power and double down on the institutions they had inherited. France comes quickly to mind. So too Latin America and Haiti. Britons, as much as those in the Americas and across the Channel, also had to recreate their state. The reason is simple and can be seen most readily in America once we cast our lens comparatively across the Atlantic. Revolution and its attendant issues like war necessitated mobilization. Mobilized people were not orderly. Yet revolution and warfare also strengthened the state, which with time would have the wherewithal to demob people who had been energized. Only the job was not easy. It required trade-offs from some groups. It meant cutting others out. And both of these tasks required power. Charles Tilley's observation that the state makes war and war makes the state has no greater proof than this period of time. States wielded extraordinary power if they were to get people under arms. But they had to figure out new social controls in order to ensure that chaos did not engulf them. Officials throughout the broader Atlantic, like those men in Philadelphia, needed to create or reinvent states that could manage the period's new pressures. All of these settlements, I hasten to add, were just as exclusionary, just as unjust, as the federal system that would emerge in what had been British North America. States were based on exclusions, whether they derived from historical constraints or from the exigencies of the revolutionary moment. This is how the sausage of state was made. And it was central to the age. In fact, we could think of the age of revolution as the age of state building. Or maybe the age of nation building is better. This state building required the glue of nation. Power or efficacy also required some semblance of legitimacy. The creation of the nation state, and just as importantly its durability, relied on the hyphen binding nation to state. For Americans, the idea of nation that gave the state-making process legitimacy could be summed up as 1776. In the very years Americans were wrangling their revolution to an end, not only did they canonize 1776, despite divergent interpretations of what it entailed, but they also constructed the myth of the Founding Fathers. Immediately after the revolution had come to an end, Americans discovered the centrality of the founders and made the Declaration of Independence the moment of national birth. Differences could be foisted upon the shoulders of the founders, but all agreed that they represented nation. The cult of the founders, as subsequent historians have called it, emerged from the very moment the revolution's settlement was being completed and when the state was being created. The broad cultural appeal of Parson Weems, I cannot tell a lie, was no accident. At this moment, too, Americans tried to create a national art. They also started down the road of laying out a national canon. It is only in the very years the founders were first being extolled as exemplars of nation and of its foundational principles that the model of Christian charity, John Winthrop's famous sermon, was rediscovered and given pride of place in the American story, suggesting that what the ideals of a city upon a hill now animated the whole nation. 1776 as shorthand for a set of ideals, 1776 as foundational moment, grew from the need to create nation. It still does, as nation building is not a one-time job, but a perpetual concern for any state. New generations, if the state is to survive, have to be bound to it. Perhaps that is why subsequent generations of Americans have lionized the founders even more vociferously than those who had fought for American independence. That is why the image right here, that's why this image still resonates. John Trumbull began the Declaration of Independence, as he called it, right when delegates were descending on Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation, but really to draft the Constitution. He was involved in creating nation through his paintbrush, as a series of paintings he completed on the American Revolution testified to. A number now hang in the Capitol Rotunda. This one has rightly been called a secular creche. It swathes the nation in origin myth, one that we still embrace to this very day. In fact, up to this very day, this painting is more or less American nation. It is no accident that men and women throughout the Atlantic were up to the very same things at this time. The American Republic was born during a broader moment of state formation and by necessity nation building. Americans sealed their revolutionary settlement and created the bases of legitimacy by looking to the founders. Others took different but complementary courses. The French, think here of Napoleon as protector of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The British, think here of Nelson and Wellington as national protectors of the crown, were up to the same thing with different materials to work with. The same could be said of the nations of Latin America that looked for their distinctiveness. The same went for Haiti. The task was urgent, as few wanted to return to the chaos of the preceding period. As with the state, this meant that some were invited to become members of the nation, others were kept on the outside looking in. That, too, was tragic. The tragedy was not guaranteed in perpetuity. The genius of the American process was that it laid out the broad parameters of subsequent national debate. To have a place at the national debate over what America was to be meant rooting arguments and justifications in the 1776 foundational moment. The fact that 1776 did this work did not obviate conflict. It could fuel it. Civil War certainly showed that. But anyone who approached the state for full inclusion within the nation and the rights that were at its roots had to come before the altar of 1776. They had to come into this room. That act is the bargain. And that act lays out the broad outline of the national struggle. The dynamic has made the nation durable, just as it has created a more just revolution settlement. The appeal to 1776 has created a more elastic understanding of belonging than that of the days when the Americans struggled to bring revolution to an end. In fact, since that time, the ending of the American Revolution has played out again and again as the nation has expanded to bring in new groups. This dynamic has ensured that the initial settlement has persisted well beyond the bloody Civil War that had to be redefined as an attempt to fulfill the promise of 1776. It has held since. In time, 1776 has allowed for national redemption over the tragic exclusions of the past. I have one more pressing question to answer. Would John Winthrop have signed the Declaration of Independence? How the hell do I know? But I reckon probably not. The assumptions of people in the 17th century bore little resemblance to those embraced by people in the 18th century. Nation building, after all, only binds those that follow the foundational moment, not those that come before. But we can be sure some of his descendants would have claimed he would have done so. Not all, I hasten to add. Some of his descendants became prominent loyalists. But as we know, New Englanders were keen to forget the loyalist strands of their past and claimed that they, more than any other group, had embraced nation. This may have been the first expansive or elastic moment I just referred to, when the settlement stretched beyond its original remit. That Copley Squared was named after the formerly loyalist painter is a great example. John Singleton Copley was whitewashed of his former loyalist associations to become the great American painter, and coincidentally, he happened to be a son of Boston. He became also a son of 1776. The resurrection of the model of Christian charity and the struggle to create a national canon and place the Puritans at the heart of it suggests as much as well. This too was a local variation on a broad Atlantic-wide process of creating new bases of legitimacy for new states born of violence. John Winthrop may not have signed the Declaration of Independence, but his ghost probably did. And that is just the point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to begin by thanking John and Robert for inviting me here, and not just because of the weather. It's a great pleasure to be in Florida in February rather than at home. And I have, in some ways, an easy, in some way, a difficult job following Patrick. In some ways, in both easy and difficult, because in many ways he said much of what I was going to say. So I'm gonna but this is good. I can kind of build on some of your points, maybe, hopefully. That's probably the best. What I would like to do here is which I sort of taken as my brief, is to consider the question: how has the founding, and I'm using the scare quotes there just to kind of indicate that, as Patrick was saying, 1776 is, a kind of catch-all term, has always been a catch-all term for a lot of different elements coming together, much of which have been imagined retrospectively. But my question is, how has the founding shaped the American political order? And in parenthesis afterwards, and how has the American political order shaped the founding? In other words, as it were, retrospectively, so some of the points that Patrick was making, how has the founding changed its meaning and been used by different groups at different points? But most of my remarks will be focused on the 19th century. So in a way, I'm going to sort of take the second half of the final portion of Patrick's paper and expand upon them. I mean, here's the core point, which I think was implicit, at least, in everything that Patrick was saying, and which may seem very obvious to everybody in this room, but I think nevertheless still deserves, in a conversation like this, to be double underlined, which is that the United States is an old country. It's a very old country in the deepest and most profound sense, which is that it is anchored in its founding moment in ways that perhaps it's especially obvious, as it were, if you look at the United States or obsessed with the United States, but look at it slightly from the outside, as I do from my perch in Oxford. This is extremely unusual. It is extremely unusual, not to say a little bit weird, that when you have political debates over whether it is abortion or gun control or healthcare or public spending or taxes, they sooner or later become constitutional questions and therefore become questions about an 18th century moment. It is not the case in Britain that when we have debates about any of those questions, we refer to the views of Pitt the Younger. The ideas even of Gladstone and Disraeli are rarely invoked in contemporary discussion. And that is, of course, true of most other countries. Are there any exceptions? Maybe a few. I mean, there is a sense in which in France, for reasons that you will readily understand, and I'll talk a little bit more about French Revolution in a moment, there is some sense that in France as well, their revolution still structures political culture, though not in quite the same way as it does in the United States. I'm not trying to be needlessly provocative in saying that perhaps another good analogy is Cuba or the Soviet Union. Just pause for a moment there. But the connection, of course, is that both of those polities were polities created at a moment of revolution, and in which that moment of revolution becomes, for the most part, inviolable. The Alexis de Tocqueville, the French liberal who famously visited the United States on a nice 2-year tour in the 1830s and wrote those 2 volumes that many of you will have read, but hodgepodges of books really, but with lots of quotable insights in them, said of his specimens, the Americans, they love change, but they dread revolutions. Well, of course they dread revolutions because they had the perfect revolution. I mean, one of the things that I've learned from Patrick's work and from discussions that he and I had when he was in Oxford last year, and which I'm sure will form the centerpiece of the Yale book that is just about to be published, is the challenge of ending revolutions. As Patrick has very convincingly argued, in a way it's easy to start a revolution. The really hard thing is to end it. The genius, in inverted commas, in the minds of many Americans of the post-founding generation in the early 19th century was, and I think Patrick's already said this, was not just the American Revolution itself. It was that the American Revolution was ended. And it's that ending that therefore creates the impetus, the compulsion to defend. As Patrick also said, this concentration, this anchoring in the founding moment is not something that has been throughout American history merely the preserve of those who want to prevent change, those who in the normal terminology are conservatives. Many of those, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, many of those advocating some of the most radical and revolutionary, in a manner of speaking, transformations in American society have done so, as Patrick effectively said, by metaphorically coming into this room and making their case in relation to the founding moment. That, after all, was why Martin Luther King, for example, in the I Have a Dream speech, begun that speech, as you'll remember, by saying that he, as a representative of Black Americans, has come today to stand in the shadow of Abraham Lincoln on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to cash a check. The check, of course, being the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, that has been by no means the only strategy advocated by radicals. but that it has so often been one that those advocating change have returned to, is telling us something very important about American political culture, which again is not so often true, or not so true in the same way, of other policies. What did radicals advocating change in 19th century Britain do? Well, they had their own version of an idealized past to which they wanted to return. They had a notion of the Norman yoke, that everything before the Norman conquest had been better and more democratic. There were, in fact, the radicals of the 17th century and the great upheavals and the revolutionary tumult in Britain in the 17th century often invoked a mythic past in order to justify radical change in the present. So looking to the past in order to advocate change is not in itself distinctive, but what is distinctive in the American case is the very strong constellation of ideas and literal documents and also institutions created in the late 18th century, which have so often been the mechanism that the advocates of change have turned to. It reminds me of the frequently, if Tocqueville is frequently quoted as he is, the person that I often go to, perhaps slightly less well known than Tocqueville, is the historian Richard Hofstadter. If there are people here who haven't read Richard Hofstadter, who was writing in the 1950s and 60s, I highly recommend. He was a great essayist, and he has a quote for every occasion. One of his most famous quotes was to say of the Americans that they were born in perfection and aspired to progress. And the reason why I like that quote is that it captures this ambivalence, this tension, which seems to me to be so central to understanding American political culture. On the one hand, an impulse to go forward, the great nation of futurity, in the words of John O'Sullivan, the Jacksonian era publicist, constantly looking forward, constant restlessness, constant geographical change. The Tocqueville and every other foreign visitor ever since has always noted the endless tearing down of buildings and the building up of the new, the endless, restless moving forward, and at the same time, the anchoring, in a sense, of the past, to adapt the metaphor of another great American writer. It's tempting to think of US political history as a whole as like a boat beating against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, for all the effort, as it were, of moving forward. So what I'm saying, in a way, in other words, is that the importance of the founding moment has created a kind of conservatism in American political culture. And this has been an interest of some of in my work. I was drawn to this question of conservatism through the empirical observation that, especially from the late 1840s onwards and through the 1850s and 1860s, literally the word conservative and conservatism was seemingly everywhere in American political discourse. And of course, you can trace these things very easily now with digital searches of newspapers and databases and Google Books and that kind of thing. People wanted to be seen as conservative. They didn't necessarily not everybody described themselves as a conservative, but they wanted to be seen as appealing to conservative men and conservative measures. I was talking to somebody who's here in the audience about this yesterday. In a way, it was difficult for me when I wrote the book about this theme, which was to explore the meaning of conservatism in American political culture in the 19th century. I knew from the outset, and so it has proved, the challenge there is to explain to people that in writing about conservatism in this way, what I'm not doing is writing about conservatism with all the associations that you all immediately have in your heads about what conservatism means in the 21st century United States. There may be connections. There may be things we can talk about that connect some of what people in the 19th century advocated with what some people who today call themselves conservatives might want. But that's of no interest or importance to me. What I'm trying to do is, as it were, look at people's self-identification as conservatives in the 19th century, as if I had no idea what was going to happen next, which I take to be, one of the tasks of a historian, which is to understand the past on its own terms and to try to get into the heads of the people who lived at the time. And it turns out, and unsurprisingly, given the way I begun this talk and the theme of this whole discussion, that the deep need that Americans across the political spectrum had in the mid-19th century and later to associate themselves with an idea of conservatism was fundamentally to do with the American founding and the political order that it had created. It was nothing to do with a particular ideological program, public policy pronouncements, anything like that. It was partly about a disposition. It was about a rejection of extremism or radicalism or ultraism, as they might have said at the time, or of Jacobinism. It was a positive association with the idea of compromise based on the notion that what was distinctive about the American founding was that these framers, very similar white elite 1%ers though they were nevertheless able to compromise their differences. And so the practice of compromise became in itself an element of what the founding had. Who are the Americans? Who are we people who have been shaped by this? We are the people who can compromise. That is how we are able to sustain a republic across the vast space. That is how we are able to sustain what appeared to Europeans, like visitors like de Tocqueville, to be this cacophony of different voices, this polyglot nation of different immigrants and different religions and Catholics and Jewish people. And how do you do that? We are the people who compromise. And on what basis do you compromise? You compromise by looking at what the framers had done and the genius, in inverted commas, of their compromises, which form the template for what we in the 1830s and 40s need to do. I just mentioned there Jacobinism as the great antithesis, as it were, to the great threat. And that's a reminder, really, that, and again, I think, Patrick kind of touched on this, that when we think about the American Revolution today in the 21st century, but when 19th century people thought about the American Revolution and the founding moment, they could not help but think about it in relation to the French Revolution. That's the fundamental. It's the contrast, the relationship between the American Revolution and the French Revolution structures the way in which in the United States, and indeed in other countries as well, when British radicals looked to the United States and British conservatives looked to the United States through the 19th century, it's through this endless contrast between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. That, of course, is what made Edmund Burke. I knew an Edmund Burke, by the way. Sometimes people used to introduce, this is Adam Smith and this is Edmund Burke. I mean, this is literally true. He was doing a PhD with me at Cambridge at the same time. Anyway, not that Edmund Burke, my old friend, but the original Edmund Burke, who, of course, was a great proponent of the rights of colonists in the 1770s, but then, of course, famously turned against the French Revolution. Now, of course, it's not as simple as that all Americans defining themselves in opposition to the French Revolution. Oh, but it were. I mean, there were many Americans who, of course, were horrified by Jacobinism and the terror in the 1790s, and who then later, after especially after 1848, were horrified by the June days and the violence in Paris. There are other Americans who, of course, who wanted to claim credit for every revolution that happened anywhere else in the world, the assumption being that the American Revolution was the template that everyone else was trying to follow. There's even, I can recall, an apparently not entirely tongue-in-cheek article in a New York paper in late 1848, which appeared to seriously claim that the public messages of President of American presidents had been circulated in European capitals and helped explain the uprisings of the 1840s. I don't think there's any evidence to say that in particular was true. But what is certainly true, of course, was that the American founding, with all its ambivalent relationship to change, its difficult questions that it raises about the point at which the revolution was ended in Patrick Griffin's terms, the compromises that were made in ending it, the people who were excluded by ending the revolution in that way, all of those ambivalences were much kind of discussed by Europeans looking hard at the American experiment, as Americans and foreigners continued to call it, through the 19th century. One of the maneuvers that some 19th century people and people who we would think of as being most anxious about further ongoing revolutionary change in American society, one of the maneuvers they made in the 19th century was not just to celebrate the ending of the American Revolution, as Patrick has explained, but also to downplay its revolutionary nature, to emphasize continuity with the British past, to see the American Revolution, as it were, as no more than a kind of necessary readjustment, or perhaps, more positively, the taking on of a particular responsibility for the advocacy of liberty from a British or an English tradition, carrying it across the Atlantic, but that continuity was more important than discontinuity. I'm thinking here of a disparate cast of peoples, many of whom supported the Whig Party and later the Republican Party. Catherine Maria Sedgwick, who's a novelist, very, very politically well-connected writer, was especially expressive about this. I've always found her writings and her letters very helpful. She wrote all the time, seemingly, apropos of nothing, in a letter to one of her relations about the idea of the American Union as the quote, the true idea of home, a place that guaranteed against all foreign intervention, a sanctuary of domestic rights and freedoms, a temple with open doors but never to be entered by the profane. The union and what had secured the permanence of our institutions and defended Americans, she's writing this in 1848, against centralization and autocracy, were religion and morality. And where did they come from? They came, of course, from the deep past, but they were channeled through English traditions of liberties. That was where the French had gone wrong, in Catherine Sedgwick's mind. I mean, they were Catholic, and that was clearly also a bad start, but they had no tradition, they had no prior tradition of liberty from which they could draw. So where the French revolutionaries had gone wrong was not in their intent, which she conceded was good, but in trying to invent everything anew. They had no template to work from. Of course, that was also an alternative view of the American Revolution. Thomas Paine, famously talked about the American Revolution. We have a new page to write on. I'm forgetting the exact phrase. Someone in here will know the phrase. But for these kind of Whiggish mid-century types, almost the opposite was true. The genius of the American Revolution was not that they were turning a new page, but they were, as it were, taking an existing template. Someone who wrote about this at great length was a Boston lawyer called George Ticknor Curtis, who wrote kind of history of the American Revolution, which simply placed the American Revolution in this long continuity, going back to Alfred, in fact, going back to the American Constitution. He wrote, this is a direct quote, "The American Constitution has its origins in the days of Alfred." This is George Ticknor Curtis in the 1840s. I'm coming towards a conclusion. Where I want to end with this, really, is to say one more sort of substantial point I'll make before ending. So the American founding structures American life, certainly through the 19th century, and I think up to the present day. But of course, the American founding is protean. And even as Patrick again said, it can generate conflict. He cited the Civil War, which is where I'm going. It can generate conflict. So the notion that 1776 creates kind of guardrails, that it bequeaths a kind of language, a common set of authorities to which people had to appeal, that I think is right. But at the same time, when you have a situation where two or more sides are both claiming to be the authentic representations of truth, of course, that can lead to even more intense conflict than otherwise. And that was certainly the case in the great conflicts of the 1850s and 60s. But the point I want to end on here really is to emphasize that even in explaining the revolutionary transformations and those who are advocating really radical changes in the United States, such as the expropriation, such as the abolition of slavery, and therefore the expropriation of millions of dollars of property and the upending of the social order in the South and all of the disorder and uncertainty that brought with it. Even those people, in my reading of their intellectual, psychological journey to that place of advocating very radical change, were usually driven by a desperate anxiety to preserve the founding as they understood it. And there is no better case for this, in my view, than Abraham Lincoln, who begun his public career with a famous speech, or subsequently became famous speech to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield when he was a young man, in which he talked about the importance of obedience to the law. It was a kind of classic cry for respect to his generation as a young man, to those who had gone before, to the sacrifices made by the revolutionaries, the founding fathers. But when Lincoln was advocating respect for the law in the 1830s, in the name of the founding, in what seems like a very sort of hardline conservative position, he was doing so because knowing, and his audience knew at the time, that close by in Alton, there had been the murder, nasty murder of an abolitionist editor. And so what Lincoln was already perceiving in the 1830s was that the threat to institutions, the threat to public order, the threat to the sense of the national collective purpose came from those who were defending the enslavement of human beings. They were the perpetrators of violence. Sometimes those attacking slavery also perpetrated violence, of course, and Lincoln wasn't blind to that. But from an early age and throughout his career, the more profound threat always, in his view, came from the enslavers of other human beings. And so I see Lincoln, and this, I admit, is not the way in which probably most of my colleagues who write about Lincoln today think about him. I see Lincoln as fundamentally a small c conservative figure, but a figure whose small c conservatism drove him to take what many others at the time, and we could say since, see as being quite radical positions. I think his commitment to ending slavery and his understanding that the only way that slavery could be ended was through war, through the circumstance of war, and his perception that it was his responsibility as commander-in-chief and as president of the United States to seize that moment and bring slavery to an end was unwavering. I mean, I think he was, I side with those colleagues who in that sense see Lincoln as a radical, and he was a radical in that sense, but I see that as an emanation, as it were, of his underlying small c conservatism. That then leads to the question. I'm going to wrap up here, but I think we may want to talk perhaps in the discussion about the question of in what sense then can I, after given everything that I've said and that Patrick said about the importance of the founding, in what circumstances can you have refoundings? What is it? What are the conditions which permit refoundings? You know that state constitutions were all rewritten in the 19th century. There was a huge wave of rewriting a state constitution. That was regarded as totally fine. Well, I would note that what happened then was that the state constitutions all became suspiciously similar to one another, and that the old state constitutions that were being replaced were, in some cases, colonial charters and so on. But nevertheless, the notion that the people collectively could come together and reconstitute their governments, at least on the state level, was, through most of the 19th century and into the 20th century, was completely uncontroversial. So we might want to think about the context in which refounding can happen. And we might want to think about this, to me, this really interesting question of the ambivalence of revolution. The ambivalence of revolution in American political culture. There are the deep, and it seems to me quite kind of visceral reaction against revolution, the Tocquevillian notion that Americans dread revolutions, and yet at the same time, sometimes, but sometimes not, welcome revolutions abroad, also push for change, and sometimes quite radical change at home. And how that relationship to revolution has shifted over time. It seems to me these are some of the questions which perhaps we may want to discuss in the time we have available. Thank you.
So we'll open questions from the floor. I have some that I'll pull off on those for those of you who might want to ask. Okay, good.
Hi, my question is about Griffin. So you talked about the durability of the United States Constitution and the United States Constitution, where I'm sure it's true. But there are certain scholars who say that durability is actually flexibility. I'm thinking of Woody Bolton, who would say that the genius of imposing order is really the genius of limiting democracy in taking the power of state governments to make certain decisions and investing it in less response to the federal government. So, and of course, Charles Beard would say the same thing, less about democracy, more about money. What do you think of that kind of thesis, saying that the Constitution's genius is actually, as Holden would say, a slur upon the capacities of people?
Well, he's coming from that tradition that basically sees the Constitution, if you will, as like a Thermidorian reaction. So the idea is that the revolution is going to unleash all these sort of like possibilities and new extraordinary opportunities. As another scholar at the time, who would be kind of aligned with Woody Holton, would say, we have to focus on the sparks from the altar of 1776 and kind of look at those kind of earlier principles and then ask ourselves the question, have we lived up to them or not? I mean, I think what I've said, a lot of it comports. I think if Woody Holton were here, I think he would agree with a great deal, actually, of what I'm saying when we talk about exclusions, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, one of the things that he does, and this is not to point him out, he's a fine historian. His last book is a tremendous book. It's an extraordinary piece of work, and I recommend it to everybody to read. But I think what he does is sort of like, it presents us with American history is kind of a bit of a morality tale. And it's the sense of, to a certain extent, you have kind of a set of ideas that are, if you will, going to be the touchstone. And then we have to figure out how all American history is going to live up to that. And I think, to be quite honest with you, as I said here, I think that misconstrues, 1776 a little bit too much by privileging it too much. And I'll go back to the Declaration of Independence. So when people first thought about the Declaration of Independence, certainly at the time of the American Revolution, it's not really a document that is considered canonical at all. It's only something that's going to be rediscovered in the 19th century as being canonical. At the time when people are thinking about the Declaration of Independence, they're getting down to those nitty-gritty ideas that I talked about. The Declaration of Independence is about justifying independence, before the world. The Declaration of Independence is trying to, if you will, get the approval of other nations throughout the world, to get the recognition of other nations throughout the world. The Declaration of Independence is making kind of a logical argument to say, as I said it, that British sovereignty has effectively collapsed. We are without protection of a sovereign. What we have to then do in these cases, like John Locke would say, we have to make an appeal to heaven, and what we have to do is reconstitute an order immediately before everything goes to hell in a handbasket. I think that is what it is. In many ways, the ideas that they use, and this to me is one of the extraordinary things about American history, the ideas that they use are boilerplate British ideas at the time in order to make that justification, but they become canonical in just the way that Adam was suggesting later on after the date. So even though I wouldn't disagree with people like Woody Holden, again, a great historian, I would just see things a little bit differently. But thank you for the question. It's a great question.
Interested in 1776 versus 1787 as a year, as a focal point, as something that becomes more meaningful. And of course, right after 1787 came the first 10 amendments, and then as Professor Smith mentions, the refounding of America with Lincoln and the Civil War, which then led to the 14th, 15th Amendments, which in effect were a significant shift in American history. So there really are kind of two foundings in America. So do we worship the Constitution as much as we worship the Declaration of Independence?
Thank you. I mean, such an interesting question, very well framed. And I mean, for Lincoln, I mean, there are people who say that what the Gettysburg Address, Gary Will said this in a book about the Gettysburg Address, that Lincoln's sleight of hand was more than that. It was fairly, you could see what his hand was doing there, but what Lincoln was doing in the Gettysburg Address was to put the Declaration of Independence, of course, it was all about 1776 and not about 1787. I mean, just as Patrick's just said that the Declaration of Independence really was just containing kind of boilerplate British paeans to liberty. In the same way, actually, the Gettysburg Address was fairly conventional stuff at the time, right? I mean, it was brilliantly expressed, and the alternative myth of the Gettysburg Address, which is that nobody noticed at the time, is not true either. And people did notice it, and people did think, yeah, that's a great speech. But in terms of the core claim that it was making, which is that everything begins in 1776, that was not by 1863 regarded as being anything especially surprising. And so then the question is, then the heart of your question then is, what is the relationship between 1776 and 1787? And that then goes to this question of, should we think about the Civil War era and the post-war amendments in particular as constituting a refounding? And the historiographical, I mean, the consensus at the moment is very much to think about it as a second founding, is the title of Eric Foner's most recent book about the post-war amendments. And I've sometimes used this term myself, and clearly there's a great deal of truth in it. There's a great deal of truth in the idea that the 14th Amendment, in particular, so fundamentally reworked the relationship between citizens. Well, first of all, defined the concept of citizenship, and reworked the relationship between US citizens and the federal government, that it does amount to a second founding. And so one question we can ask ourselves then is that, why wasn't that the way it was talked about at the time? Why don't we talk about the Second American Republic like, we've talked about successive French republics, right? And the thing is, we don't, and people didn't at the time. These at the end of the day remain amendments to a constitution, however dramatic they are. And so that tells you something too, doesn't it? So and it's holding these things in balance. It's neither one thing nor the other, and that's what makes it so fascinating. So it's not that it wasn't completely, it was a sort of second founding, but it was only a sort of second founding. And that's exactly why it's interesting.
We can also just briefly say that Thomas Jefferson was a better wordsmith than Gouverneur Morris, when it came to those documents, that's for sure.
My question is for Dr. Smith. So I heard you talk about the 1840s revolution in Europe, and then the 1860s thinking. I was curious about this intervening years where this unique myth of 1776 didn't get fully established, and it was, maybe you mentioned it, but did the War of 1812, did that play a role in that at all?
Do you want to take that one, Patrick? I mean, it's been addressed to me, but I suspect you've probably got more to say about it. I mean, yes, it's a great question, right? I mean, the War of 1812 is probably, the most important, least understood moment there are other contenders, but in United States history, it has sometimes been called, and I think, again with some justification, a second war for independence, and I think that was true not because of geopolitics, right? It wasn't literally in that sense a second war for independence, though it did do useful things in terms of clarifying the balance of power in the North American continent. Insofar as it was a second war of independence, it was because of the shift in the nationalist literature that it generated, the re-articulation, the redefinition of what the American Empire, as it was sometimes at that time called, what the American Empire meant and what it stood for in a North American context in which there were other competing imperial entities. And the United States was an imperial entity, obviously, in North America, just as the British and the Spanish and the French were. And it articulated for Americans why they deserved to be top dog, at least in North America. But yeah, what do you got?
No, I'll tell you, it's a great question, and that isn't only it's the kind of the understudied war, but also I think it's probably the underappreciated war in some ways, because I think Adam's exactly right. I would agree with him. One scholar has written that one of the chief tasks at the end of the American Revolution for Americans was to unbecome British. So that's one thing. So there's a lot of people, of course, are going to talk about those continuities, but one of the things are, if you're going to create a nation, you have to come up with things that are, if you will, somehow distinctively American. What the War of 1812 does, for many people anyway, it's the first moment that they can point out to a distinctively American moment. It's a post-British moment. So it is, I think it is, at the popular level especially, it's kind of a moment when Americans begin to embrace certain positive aspects of what it is to be American. And so they move beyond just saying we're not British into what are those things that make us really distinctive and what make us really who we are. And it's another time, too, it would be interesting. I'd never thought about this, but certainly I would say at this time, too, you have a heightened appreciation, of course, for the founding. And I'd probably say they double down on that understanding and appreciation that they are the people rooted in that earlier moment.
Can I just add just a little point on the end there? I have a former graduate student called Billy Coleman, who's written a terrific book about music in the early American Republic. And what he found was that, you all know that, listen to me doing that southern yawl there, you all know that the Star Spangled Banner was written in the War of 1812. What Billy's research showed was that was just there was an explosion of popular patriotic songwriting during the War of 1812, and so that just kind of reinforces Patrick's point.
So my question deals with phrasing the Declaration of Independence, in which it states that to preserve these rights, however restricted to among men, to regulate just powers to consent to the government. With the discussion of the Civil War, you mentioned the legacy of compromise with the Declaration, but when there is compromise, sometimes there's not a consent on either party's side. The compromise strips some of that away. So how much of maintaining a proper state is compromise versus sometimes stripping that away and recognizing that there's a lack of consent of the government that needs to be rectified?
Brilliant question. That what you've just said is that is the central question people wrestled with in the run-up to the American Civil War. That's exactly the point. At what point do you say everything needs to be renegotiated? If government is supposed to be based on the consent of the governed, well, it isn't right now, and so we need to go back to square one. As opposed to, as you rightly say, the kind of the alternative model, which is to kind of accept the existing order and say, no, what we really need to do is we just got to make this work. If we just try harder, if we believe more, if we're more patriotic, if we have more faith, we can just make this work just like the founders did, right? Forgetting that, of course, actually what the founders did was to show up to Philadelphia supposedly just trying to tinker around with the Articles of Confederation and ended up doing something completely revolutionary, right? So, I don't know, your question is, how do we, I mean, I don't have an answer to in what circumstances you or we should go down one route rather than the other, but I just thank you for kind of framing it in that way, because that's just such a central question in American history as a result of the way in which this country was founded.
I'll just say that it's a great question, but it makes me think actually of the question that you posed to all of us about refoundings. As you put it, everything. There are times when people say everything needs to be renegotiated. And that sounds nice to us. And refounding sounds like a nice idea to us. But believe me, those of us who study revolution understand that refoundings are not easy things. They're not to be underestimated at all. They usually not only bring all sorts of chaos, it usually brings a lot of bloodshed and a lot of difficulty and creates unbelievable divisions. And those, I think, kind of calls for refounding bring us to kind of potentially a very, very difficult place that I think Americans have been fortunate to really have kind of escaped since the days of the Civil War. That's fundamentally what the Civil War was, that we have to have a refounding. Refoundings can occur, I think, if you will, kind of if we think about reforming certain things that are done. And I think going back to kind of still rooting things in earlier mythic conceptions, but you throw them out the window, you do it at your own peril.
And then even then, in the Civil War context, the answer to the question I posed myself a few minutes ago, why do we not talk about a second American Republic, is because the point of the Civil War from the point of view of the people in charge of the Union was that it was first and foremost to preserve something. And you have to preserve something by doing an awful lot of changing and doing an awful lot of damage, and an awful lot of people die. But then if the first thing you do at the end of it is to say, actually, you know what, we're going to go back to the beginning, then you've undermined your whole raison d'etre in the war. And that's why the 14th Amendment was an amendment, and why nobody contemplated it being any notion of the notion of a new constitutional convention or a new would have been complete anathema for exactly that.
Can I ask you both a question? So, like, one of the complaints sometimes against historians is that we're a tribe of scholars who just pours acid on everybody's myths, right? Or on everybody's truths. Yeah, but so you made the point, Adam, that the United States is an old nation, which means it's a durable nation. So I guess maybe the question I put to both of you all is there a there with the American Revolution, right? I mean, and why after it is that thing that emerged from it durable? Was there something about the way that it emerged from the revolutionary process that you've talked about, Pat, that actually allowed for a sort of durability, that allowed for maybe a potential second refounding, that allowed for really violent at times without ever fully breaking the fabric?
I'll take a stab at that. We are. Historians are certainly mythbusters. I mean, that's one of the things that we do. So you invite us into the house. That's one of the things we're going to do. We're going to break things. But I hasten to add that these myths really do matter. Going back to the point we were just talking about before with the refounding, they matter. And they are very, very important, and we have to deal with them very, very carefully. I really, having studied kind of how the Atlantic world descended into revolution, I can tell you kind of when myths start going out the window, that's when you start seeing the furies begin to emerge in a certain sort of way. But I think in the United States, that said, with the myth that we more or less fell upon, we are extraordinarily fortunate indeed. Perhaps, dare I say, even exceptionally so, getting back to the points that Adam was making about these other nations that were either kind of founded during the Age of Revolution like France or refounded as they were like Britain during this particular age. We like to say, as Americans anyway, that we are a people who root our sense of self in a set of ideas. And some people will say that makes us distinctive somehow. Perhaps. I just think it's very, very fortunate. Maybe it is just, let's say, fortune, maybe it's good luck and providence, call it what you will, that we look at this period now and we have canonized those kinds of ideas. And I think one of the great fortunate thing we have is, as I say, that when I was answering your very good question about Holton and neo-progressive scholars, is the very ideas that I was not so much poo-pooing, but just trying to really put into a context and really try to understand, when they will be canonized later on, they will create this elasticity that's premised upon the innate dignity of every human being. And so that allows for more people to go, like I said before, to enter that room with time. Okay? That's not perfect, but as Adam was saying, that is progress. And for that, I will take the myths any day.
I definitely don't think I'm an acid pourer. And I am, of course, as Patrick just says, of course, what we do is we contextualize, and we are very good at spotting ways in which things become real because people believe them to be real, right? But that's fine, right? That makes them real then, which is what he's just said. I don't think I'm an acid pourer, also because I am very happy to say that I personally, despite not myself, as you may all have spotted by now, being American, I do actually think that the American founding was an extraordinary moment which has done an awful lot of good for humankind. I mean, I'm quite happy to be videoed, and that may not go down well with all of my hello people at home, but that is genuine, and I have always kind of believed that, which is of course not to say that everything is perfect and that this isn't a country like every other country with its problems and its sinful past and its systems of oppression and its massive systemic inequality. All of that said, I'm not actually, in saying that, I'm not particularly a fan of the American Constitution. I think it was kind of quite badly drafted in some ways, leaving far too much open to interpretation by the judiciary. I kind of hate the separate election of an executive. I basically think parliamentary systems are better. I think that you Americans have got yourself into a tremendous pickle with the Electoral College, which I think is very hard to defend, but completely unreformable. I think whenever you get to a situation in any polity where your institutions are perceived and really are essentially unreformable, there is no imaginable route to a meaningful constitutional amendment on pretty much anything probably, but especially on things like reforming the Senate or the Electoral College, then I think, you are storing up more and more tension, which may well is already bursting into social tension and violence. And we may well see, in the next couple of decades, who knows, a kind of bigger scale rejection by a rising generation of existing American institutions and the American experiment or the founding, whatever, than this country has ever seen before, right? More than in the 1960s, more in a certain way than in the 1860s. And if that happened, and there is a discourse on the left now, which seems to me to be more rejectionist of the American founding, in inverted commas, than has been typical of radical movements in American history before. And if that trend continues, that's very dangerous, very dangerous. But if it continues, it will be, at least in part, because of the inflexibility of American institutions. So I'm not a big fan of the Constitution, but I do think that the founding has left a very positive legacy. But I'm more a 1770s, even though obviously they were traitors writing that document. And in things, well, they were. I mean, that's not a controversial statement, right? That's just simply a matter of fact. Some of these people had literally, had sworn oaths of loyalty to them. They literally, obviously, were traitors. I'm just saying. But, and obviously, if the French hadn't intervened and won the war on the, then, we wouldn't be having this discussion now. So, but for all that, I think there were good ideas contained in
Well,
that.
now it's getting interesting.
They'll let you back in the country.
A lot of people suddenly wanted to ask questions at this point.
I'm trying to process and what you just said and collect myself here. But my question is that in the early to mid 19th century, there was a veneration of the founders and romanticizing. And we know that memory and history are not always the same. And so my question is, do you see a parallel between this and the myth of the lost cause?
Oh, I think there are, and as you put it, because memory and history are kind of so bound together. But I think that, I'm no expert in this. Adam would be the guy who would be. The myth of the lost cause has to do kind of like trying to make sense ultimately of defeat and trying to ennoble defeat. I think that's what it is. I think the American founding is sort of a different story. It's trying to rationalize and justify not only independence, but as I put it, kind of all the revolutionary issues that come along with it. So I would see the two, even though both are going to be bound up in various forms of myth making, as being fundamentally different just because of that very, very simple point.
I agree.
Carlos last.
Last. No, one thing I want to support what Roland was saying. Like, I think that in the Constitution of the United States, there are traces that show that there is a strong connection with the classics. And that makes it entirely different from the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a complete break with the classics. And like Rousseau, Montesquieu, etc., like completely broke with the classics. So, and one point that you find in the Constitution of the US that is very important, I think, is that the law is not seen as the will of the people, just that. And then, like Hamilton, I think it was Hamilton, some people say it was Madison, but Hamilton said, well, the judiciary represents the law, not the people. And I think that's entirely different from what happened in France. I think that's why France couldn't endure. It was unstable in itself, while here there was a different influence. And you see in the Paris papers this constant awareness of what the classics say and what the weakness of democracies are, and why the US is not a democracy, but a republic. That is, I find very interesting. Yeah.
I'll just say, Adam, of course, suggested that early on Americans, and indeed he's right about this, are going to try to disassociate themselves from the French Revolution, particularly after the Terror, even though there have been many people that were going to be big fans of France and wanted to saw the two, as they called it, as sister revolutions and movements that were necessarily aligned. They're going to step back, and there's going to be this extraordinary revulsion against France from across the spectrum, even Thomas Jefferson, for example, disavowing much of what's going to be going on in France. So much so that we mentioned Thomas Paine before, that when Thomas Paine ultimately dies in America, there's only going to be a small handful of people that are going to be at his funeral. It's just a couple of kind of just Jacobin radicals, and a small number of them are going to remember him now as being someone who was of the age. But if you also see the distinctions between France and America in just the points that you're saying. Fundamentally, I think the French Revolution, certainly as it developed over time, and we see this, by the way, in like even the way space is laid out in Paris after the Revolution, it has to do with the erasing of the past, absolutely erasing of the past, and creating something new ex nihilo. That's what the French Revolution is about. But in order to do that, They just couldn't, for example, put their capital in the middle of a swamp as they did on the Potomac River. What they had to do is they had to literally boulevardize. So they had to kind of knock down all of these old neighborhoods in order to kind of make straight a path for the new republic and what it would be. And I think that's actually getting to the point that you're talking about. As Adam said earlier on, the one thing that Americans are able to do, some Americans in the 19th century, they're able to make this claim to continuity because fundamentally all the ideas that they're going to be lionizing as being distinctively American are fundamentally boilerplate 18th century, 17th century British ideas. That's what they happen to be. The French are still kind of talking from that same kind of handbook to a certain extent. But for the French to create a sense of themselves as somehow being exceptional, it means erasing that past completely.
And I would just add though that although I mean I agree with your characterization of the American Revolution, and what you just said was what a version of that many people said in the 19th century, and I was concentrating on my little talk on the kind of people who would have endorsed what you just said. But there is, of course, an alternative tradition, and although there weren't very many people at poor old Tom Paine's funeral, there were, by the time that Tocqueville came to America in the 1830s, America was a democracy. I mean, it was everybody agreed that what was America, it was a democracy, right? So very rapidly, while it's of course true that the Founding Fathers were appalled by the idea of democracy, of course, the Constitution was designed to limit the voice of the people and all of that. Of course that's true. And it, of course, remains true to this day that there's no constitutional right to vote in the United States, and so on and so on. But, and it's a very, very big but, nevertheless, what democracy has come to mean has been defined by practice and ideas in the United States very early on after the Revolution, right? So when Tocqueville came here and wrote this book called Democracy in America, the point was, his assumption was, and using all these kind of meteorological metaphors, that this was, the wave of the future, the unstoppable, the world would become a democracy. And there was nothing we could do about it. We, in old Europe, could do about it. So the best we can do is to go to the United States and to find out what on earth this means. And much of what he found, he kind of wrinkled his nose at. But, nevertheless, he was kind of impressed by some other bits. And in any case, the underlying point was, well, it's going to happen, right? Because, the voice of the people, in inverted commas, once unleashed, cannot be silenced. And so, Patrick was, I don't know whether you were quoting Woody Holton or whether you were just saying it yourself, but the sparks of 1776, there's obviously a huge literature on this, but, those radical democratic elements of the American Revolution, took root in very powerful ways very early, obviously bounded by race and gender. But, the remarkable thing about the United States by the early 19th century was the breadth of its suffrage, but more than that, the sense among, white working men that they were sovereign, that it was literally their government. And that was what, the people, 19th century Britain, when news of Abraham Lincoln's assassination reached Britain in 1865, there were huge public meetings. One on the town moor in Newcastle was the biggest that anyone had ever seen. That meeting was called by Joseph Cowen, who was a Tyneside radical. And the speech that he gave to this crowd of grown men, colliers, pitmen, dockyard workers, reportedly in tears at the news of the death of Abraham Lincoln. And it was because Lincoln was a working man with no education, hardly any education, who'd risen to be head of state. Where else in the world could that happen other than the United States? And, the Chartism, the great radical movement in Britain was, in America, the People's Charter had already put into effect. So it was democracy that the American Revolution came to represent for large swathes of people, not just here, but around the world as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much of all the future Hamilton.